Hello and welcome to Africa Speaks. I'm Joy Doreen Bira. All eyes have been on Africa, with the world joining the search for the missing Nigerian teen girls. Also, South Africa went to the polls on May 7, and the latest news from South Sudan as well, that has seen Riek Machar and Salva Kiir sign a ceasefire deal that is meant to see all hostilities quelled in the next 24 hours, actually, from the time the agreement was signed. This and more on Web City. South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and rebel chief Riek Machar have signed a ceasefire deal vowing to end nearly 5 months of civil war, with the U.S. urging both sides to swiftly implement their promises. The two leaders, who shook hands and then prayed together, agreed that immediately all hostile activities will stop within 24 hours from the signing of this agreement. Kiir, explaining his olive branch to his bitter rival, told reporters that as leader he had in the past accepted compromises and had been in a position to make peace with everybody.
I want to assure you that I and my the party I'm leading, and the army that I'm leading, will implement this agreement without any fail.
By me signing today this agreement, I'm sending the signal that this conflict must be ended peacefully. I hope the other side will also be serious on this matter.
At Boniface Mwangi says two people in South Sudan disagreed over power, leading to killings of thousands and displacements of hundreds of thousands. I support the ICC. Dennis Onsarigo adds the South Sudan crisis has been resolved the African way. Hundreds must die with their blood. A peace agreement is penned. At John Hudson asks how long before they break the promises in the agreement. And U.S. Secretary of State at John Kerry says it's a breakthrough on South Sudan peace agreement is signed. Hard work required to go from here. Boko Haram on Monday claimed responsibility for the abduction of hundreds of schoolgirls in northern Nigeria that has triggered international outrage, threatening to sell them as slaves. 53 of the girls managed to escape from the militants, but 223 were still being held. Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan has been under mounting pressure to act since gunmen stormed the girls' school on April 14, forcing them from their dormitories onto tracks and driving them into the bush. In his first public comments on the abduction on Sunday evening, Jonathan pledged that the government would find the girls and return them to their families. And this has sparked international online campaigns under the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. At Obiezex says we shall keep hope alive that our Chibok girls shall return home. Our military, buoyed up with global support, shall bring back our girls. Actress at Emma Watson tweets it's important that these men are held accountable for their crimes and that we keep up the pressure to find these girls. Atro Samuel adds, in the last 1 week, Boko Haram is reported to have attacked another community and killed over 300. The government is quiet. As news from around the continent. Now, ever imagined what TV anchors go through when hosting extremely emotional guests? Much still, what is hidden behind the tables? Well, in Jordan, some guests have fought one another live on television, and some even pulled guns at TV anchors. Take a look at this.
This is the moment two journalists taking part in a TV debate in Jordan became so angry with each other they wrecked the studio live on air. The pundits were taking part in a debate on the crisis in Syria when the discussion became a little bit heated. The men quickly start pushing the studio table at each other until the top breaks off. as the TV host struggles to hold the two apart.
المنحرف هو الذي يقايض المواقف. انت اللي بتقايض. هو الذي هو الذي يتنطنط. انت اللي يتنطنط من حكم الى حكم ويخلي من يدفع تخلص. لا انت اللي بدأت. انا اخلص. لا يا انت اللي بدأت. يا شاكر انت اللي شاكر يا اخوان انت اللي بدأت.
Whilst the table tug of war escalated pretty quickly, nobody seems to score a decisive victory.
ابو سليمان خلي كلامك معي يا سيدي. خلي كلامك معي. لا دقيقة. لا لحظة. لا دقيقة لحظة. لا دقيقة. ابو سيف.
So television can get that bad in Jordan. I've never seen something like that in Africa, but it would be interesting. Only in South Africa, where one guest almost hit the other just because he used racist words, which is, of course, very expected in a country like South Africa. A lot of people are xenophobic there. But now we get into the platform, and today we are looking into the plight of journalists. Al Jazeera journalist Peter Greste has become a symbol of all that could be right or wrong in Africa, and he has been in solitary confinement for the past months for terrorism-related charges. He and two other Al Jazeera journalists have been charged with creating a negative impact on overseas perceptions of Egypt. However, Peter Greste is not alone. He joins a number of other African journalists arrested in countries like Eritrea, Ethiopia, Equatorial Guinea, who have been behind bars for months or even years. And Africa Speaks Today hosts Andrew Greste, a brother to Peter Greste, who visits his brother on a weekly basis, that is in the Egypt prison where he's being jailed, and also Ethiopian journalists Fasil Girma and Betre Jacob, currently in exile in Kenya. Well, welcome all to the show. I do appreciate you coming over to speak to us about the plight of journalists. So today we're using the hashtag plight of journalists. If you are on Twitter, you can use that hashtag, and we're asking the question, should freedom of expression of journalists be limited across the African continent? And we are having an increased number of blogging journalists as well. And do you believe that some of these bloggers or journalists across the African continent are financially supported to go against their governments? Are today's blogging journalists cognizant of the media laws? That is a discussion we're just about to have. So the hashtag is plight of journalists. Be sure to join us now. Andrew, thank you so much for making it to the Africa Speaks studio. I don't know, from the time you first visited Peter Greste in jail, what was his experience? What exactly did he say? Because I'm sure right now you're speaking on his behalf because he just has no voice at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. I guess he was just on a short-term assignment in Egypt, conducting typical journalist's role. You know, they were collecting news and speaking to various different people with various different opinions, and he was just, you know, what he describes as just a fairly mundane type of assignment.
Right. And from that experience of what he has so far told you, how does that make you feel, knowing that this is a family member of yours that probably should be going on with his normal duties as an investigative journalist, if that is what I've read about Peter Greste, and also seen him doing stories in Kenya? How does that make you feel, knowing that one of your family members is in jail for the wrong reasons, most probably?
Oh, look, it's extremely difficult and stressful on the family. He's been there now for 130 days. The court process, the trial's still continuing, and it's difficult to see Peter locked up in some pretty punitive conditions, and from what we've seen so far, pretty weak evidence. There hasn't been really any evidence to substantiate the claims that have been made against him.
Right, so he's supposed to go to court for the 8th time. Is it this week or the coming week?
He's facing court next Thursday for the 8th time. So
for the 8th time.
That's right, yes.
Right, and from that, do you think that that says quite a bit about Africa in terms of freedom of expression that they give to journalists, from your view the time that you have been in Egypt and what you have observed?
Well, obviously, it's difficult operating in Egypt. I mean, Egypt is going through a transitional phase. It's had a number of governments over the last 3 years, so obviously there's some, challenges there at the moment, which we see because Peter, he's an award-winning journalist with some very high credentials, and to see him behind bars obviously indicates that it's difficult there.
Right. All right. I'll now move to Betre Yacob. Betre Yacob is the president of Ethiopian Journalists Forum, and he moved to Kenya recently. I guess he was running away from the government's, face, because knowing what is going on in Ethiopia, there are over 100 journalists who have been jailed, and of course the latest of them being the bloggers, that is the Zone 9 bloggers who were jailed weeks ago, who were arrested weeks ago, and for all various reasons. But Ethiopia is always a difficult country to be a journalist. Jacob, tell us your experience. What exactly drove you into exile?
Yeah, being a journalist is very difficult in Ethiopia. You face several challenges because of your activities, journalist activities. You get harassed, and you may get jailed, or you may face serious grave problems because you are writing, maybe criticizing the regime, and like this. Anyway, Zone 9 members are my friends, and I know them well. As my understanding, just they have never done anything wrong. Just they are arrested because they were writing against the government.
Great. Fasil, let me hear from you. How limited is freedom of expression in Ethiopia? You've been in Kenya for over a year now. How limited would you describe it? And is it just limited for journalists, or it's limited for every other citizen in the country?
Well, it's now the word journalism is being synonym to the word terrorism in Ethiopia, and it's very limited for journalists to exercise their profession freely there. They are being prosecuted as a terrorist, and there are journalists arrested and they are in prison, and they are labeled as terrorists. So far, there are also other journalists who are being detained. So when you see for journalists, it's very limited. Also, the civic societies are banned to exercise freely. They do not have the right to raise fund more than 10% of their annual budget from foreign sources. So they don't have the right to exercise their jobs freely. So indirectly, they are limited to speak freely for those who are being accused, or for those whose rights are being violated.
Right. So before you came to Kenya, what stories were you reporting on? What kind of stories did you write for you to be, treated that way, or for you to decide, what, Ethiopia is not a good country for me to be a journalist, let me move to Kenya? What kind of stories were you reporting on?
I was a general reporter, used to report on all spheres, but most commonly on politics and about the political parties struggle there, and more of I was outspoken to let the public media be more professional and impartial to the public. However, the condition there is different. There are a lot of gatekeepers in the public media, and there is high trend of censorship. So I try to organize a group of journalists to help them engage in investigative journalism and anti-corruption movements, and we were able to have the Journalists Anti-Corruption Forum, Ethiopian Journalists Anti-Corruption Forum. However, we denied to have the license, so all this process made me a target, and I was under surveillance.
Great. Well, in case you're watching us, you can make a contribution using the hashtag Plight of Journalists. It's right there on your screen. And in studio with me today are Andrew Greste, brother to Peter Greste of Al Jazeera. And we also have Fasil Girma, who is an exiled Ethiopian journalist, has been in Kenya for over a year. And we also have Jacob Betre, who is the president of the Ethiopian Journalists Forum, has been in Kenya at least a few months now, and also in exile. And we are discussing the plight of journalists. At what point do journalists go or write outside of the media laws? And that is a question that seems to be asked over and over again, especially now that social media is playing a huge role in passing on messages that is breaking news. At what point do we say, look, here I think we are working outside of the media laws, especially in Africa? I'll come back to you, Andrew. You have seen the kind of stories that Peter Greste has done for Al Jazeera Network, and most of them are always investigative stories, but probably the fact that what was happening in Egypt at the time seemed to have been a little bit too political, and yet he was just doing a normal story. Has he explained anything in regard to the situation of other journalists who are jailed in Egypt?
Oh, not really. I mean, Peter was only there on a 3-week assignment, so he was doing nothing that he considered to be controversial at all. So I guess, you know, he finds himself caught up in the broader political issues that surround Egypt, I think. He'd done a couple of stories on typical Egyptian life, on a football team, on a charity that was operating in Egypt, and also obviously he was covering some of the protests that were going on in Egypt at the time.
Right. Okay. And for me, as a journalist in Kenya or as a journalist in East Africa, we know that there are countries where it could be difficult to be a journalist. For instance, in South Sudan, it's not that easy for you to actually just go and shoot any kind of building, any story. The same could apply to a country like Uganda or even Rwanda, where the state does control what is written in the media. But then from your point of view, you know, knowing that you came all the way from Australia, where you said you were working on a grain farm,
yes,
all the way to Egypt just to take care of your brother. I mean, it does say a lot about what you've so far learned about African journalism. Any observations that you would like to share with us?
Well, look, it's been an extremely confronting experience coming from Australia, where it's, you know, relatively peaceful, and to be exposed to the sort of things that are going on in and around this region. And I guess my primary purpose for coming here was to support Peter, because it's been very difficult for him in an Egyptian prison. The conditions are quite tough, and only family members are allowed to visit him. So it's been quite a gruelling experience for him, and I guess that was my #1 priority, but it has been definitely an eye-opener to see firsthand some of the conditions and some of the things that journalists have to face.
Great. Jacob, I'll now come to you. You're only just a few months into Kenya, and I'm sure you've seen a difference between the journalism in Kenya and the journalism in Ethiopia. What are some of those differences? Have you seen any similarity at all?
Yes, for sure. Yes, we share something in common, as we all are journalists. But I see very big difference between the journalism in the two countries. For example, there in Ethiopia, you know, beside the repression and like this, there is a professionalism problem there. For example, when you see our newspapers and magazines, you see several problems on our design and layout, like this. Here I see well organized newspapers and magazines, very attractive to read, you know, they catch your eyes, and I see these things. The other basic difference is that just in Ethiopia, here just journalists can touch different issues, you know. When you come to the situation in Ethiopia, you know, there are some specific agendas that are untouchable, you know. If you touch them, just you'll get problems. That's why journalists often cover reporters on such cases, you know.
Right. So let me ask something. What stories does the state expect the journalists to report on? Stories about what they're doing for the country? Are you expected to report about hunger? Are you expected, you know, what kind of stories are you expected to do in Ethiopia?
Yeah, the government expects every journalist to report on the national development activities, you know, about the programs of the government, what the government is doing, and like this. But it is very dangerous to report on corruption, poor governance, and about the political failure of the regime. These issues are very sensitive there in Ethiopia nowadays.
Great. Fasil, do you think that the number of journalists who have been exiled in the United States, that is from Ethiopia, you know, we have bloggers who are seeking asylum in different countries. Yourself, you are in exile in Kenya. Do you think that this continuous trend is going to have an end at some point, or that is going to be until the current regime is phased out and now we can see another regime that is allowing journalists to do their job?
It's a bit frustrating for me. So far there are like more than 50 journalists living in exile in US and European countries, also here. We are also expecting some other journalists are coming, since recently at the end of this month, government arrested like 3 journalists and 6 bloggers, and this intimidates most of the journalists. So they are looking a way to escape. You know, once you get in prison, they label you as a terrorist and you end up there. Nobody wants to stay in prison there. So most of them are looking ways to go out, and that's a bit frustrating. I'm not sure how long this government will stay. We have an election next year, but most probably this government will continue, since I don't believe there will be a fair and free election. So I'm a bit frustrated. I can't tell you.
But do you believe, because there have been allegations, especially from Ethiopia, that there are some journalists or bloggers who are being financially supported by international NGOs to write against the government or even do stories against the government? Do you think that is a true allegation, or does it even have any sense of truth?
I don't know about that. I mean, there are journalists who come here and take professional trainings and go back. They just came here to share experience with different journalists and non-governmental international organizations. And for example, when you see these journalists, they are accused of having relation with international human rights organizations and taking money and materials from these international organizations and trying to incite violence to the public. But there is no proof. I'm familiar with their jobs as a journalist and as a blogger. They have nothing to do with these allegations. It's just a customary allegation of the Ethiopian government to silence journalists, yes.
All right, now let's just take a look at some of the feedback that's coming through social media, that is Facebook and Twitter. And Jennifer Uloma Igwe from Nigeria is saying, "It pains me that because of the way the station I work for is structured, I cannot, for example, follow up stories on the missing girls in Nigeria. It's not in my zone, and I guess some of them are just being too careful because of what the government is doing at the moment. One of my colleagues was killed by Boko Haram after a telecast, and we have no insurance cover. So if you get killed, that's all. It ends there and nothing is done. Although they are doing stories, I expect them to do more, and I think that needs to be taken care of by the media houses." And this is just an experience coming in from Nigeria. But also looking at more experiences, there are so many questions that of course journalists would ask. For instance, she's saying some of the journalists do not even have insurance cover, so them going to very insecure zones, for instance northern Nigeria as well as South Sudan, it gets very difficult for journalists to do their job. Mate Tongola is saying, that is on Twitter, he's saying, "Are media owners taking care of their journalists? How many stand by them during their work-related court cases?" And we're also having one coming in.
well, Joy is saying great conversation on plight of journalists. And we also have Mpakuyanik Ian, who is saying the media is the massage, and at the same time the media is the mass age. So media sets the agenda of the day, and if the plight of journalists is not set as an agenda, then that doesn't come out very clearly. And we also have Kiplagat Arabet, who is saying for the first time I'm watching Africa Speaks, and it's one of those topics of discussion, the plight of journalists. Justin Mwangi is saying bloggers should be responsible in whatever they post. Many bloggers are made by some politicians to be against the government. Well, continue sending in your responses under the hashtag plight of journalists as we continue to discuss the same. Yesterday, Andrew, when we met you at the press conference, you did talk about a message that Peter Greste had for the rest of the journalists across Africa. Maybe you might want to resound the message to everybody who is watching and all the other journalists who could be watching the show right now.
Oh, there was a couple of messages that I guess Peter expressed to me, that he felt that you know, journalists have a responsibility to report ethically and in a balanced view. That he's quite proud of the fact that currently we haven't really seen any concrete evidence that's been incriminating for them in the court, and that sort of is a message that he's learnt, that that I guess he's very proud of the fact that there hasn't been any incriminating evidence. So it's important that you know, journalists maintain a high ethical standard, so those sort of allegations can't stick.
Great. Now I'll move on as we wind up. Fasil, what would be your final remarks in terms of freedom of expression of African journalists? What do you think the future of Ethiopia looks like?
I believe African journalists should strengthen their solidarities and express their concerns about the freedom of expression and press freedom issues in any country in the continent, and show their supports to journalists that are in prison or detained. And the future of Ethiopian press depends on the current regime. Unless they amend the laws and try to stop arresting journalists and release other journalists, I don't think things will change.
So you
it's
think
a big
things are going
gloomy
to
for
remain
me.
the same
for
quite some time?
Exactly.
Jacob, I'll have your final remarks. What do you think that the bloggers in Ethiopia at this point in time, or even the rest of the journalists, need to do to be able to work within the law but at the same time continue to do their job as the president of the Ethiopian Journalists Forum?
Yeah, you know, in Ethiopia there are laws which prohibit journalists to exercise their jobs. For example, the anti-terrorism law. And I don't want to say that journalists should, bloggers should respect this law, since the law is violating their rights. But I believe that bloggers should be responsible for what they are posting, you know. They should be governed by some basic principle of journalism. But you know, if they accept all the laws and the regulations that Ethiopia is using, I think their work will be interrupted. That's why I don't want to say that, but I believe they should respect some journalistic principles, you know.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll just wind up here with one of the views that came in from Uganda. And this one did come in from a gentleman called Bernard Tabaire, who works for the Sunday Monitor in Uganda. And he does mention the fact that in some countries, freedom of expression is only limited when the government says go ahead and do this. Then that is the only freedom that they get. And if the government is not in for it, then the freedom is limited. He quotes examples like Uganda, like South Sudan, and also countries like South Africa, where a lot of limitations are given, as well as Rwanda. Well, thank you all for your contributions. There's quite a lot of feedback on Twitter. hashtag plight of journalists, but you can continue to let the conversation roll on social media as well. And I'll just wind up here with one more. Media's the mirror of society and should carry the responsibility of what they cover, no matter the outcome. And we're also bringing into concern the bloggers, the increasing number of bloggers, some of them even journalists. At what point do they go beyond what they are supposed to be writing or what they're supposed to be posting on these blogs, and when are they supposed to work outside of the media laws? You know, that is something that continues to challenge African bloggers. Well, thank you all for making time for Africa Speaks today. I'm Joy Doreen Bira, and to my guests, thank you all for making it. Andrew Graste, Fasil Girma, and also Jakob Betry. It was a pleasure having you in studio. Well, good afternoon and God bless.